The Sharecropper's Rosebush. Clayton pulled his car over to the side of the narrow blacktop road as far as he could and walked around the car to see if there was enough clearance there for another vehicle to get by. He decided he was probably far enough off to the side that someone could squeak by. He hadn't passed another car in either direction since he had turned north off Highway 3 between Atoka and Antlers, Oklahoma, onto the Miller Jumbo Road. That drive east from Atoka had brought back a flood of memories, especially as he passed the Atoka Pushmataha County line where the old Darwin store had stood back in 1954. He remembered how him and his little brother had walked 3 miles from one of the numerous little shotgun shacks in this area that his family had lived in to that old Darwin store. They had used the quarter their mom had given them to buy a quart of kerosene for the lamp the family used for light. The kerosene cost a dime, and for themselves they bought 2 soda pops for 6 cents each and 3 cents worth of penny candy. Pretty good haul for a quarter compared to what 25 cents will get you today. This old highway was filled with a lifetime of memories, but Clayton was able to let them fly by like trailers from a Hollywood movie until he came to the Darwin Cemetery. He slowed down a little as he glanced out across that field of stone and thought about pulling into the cemetery, but decided that, although it was something he would have to deal with eventually, he could put off that meeting with the ghost of his past until a later date, after he had reinforced himself with a few more pleasant memories from his childhood. Maybe it would be best to save that stop until he was leaving Pushmataha County for what would more than likely be his last time. Clayton had pulled off the side of the Miller Road right where the entrance to the old Tarkington place had been. Back when they lived here, there had been an old run-down cattle guard, but now there was a brand-new aluminum gate, complete with a chain and lock. He glanced up to where the house had once stood and saw nothing remain but a fallen-down chimney and a bunch of overgrown weeds. This was where his family lived in 1965 when Clayton had graduated from high school at Moyers, Oklahoma. An old farmhouse with no electricity, no running water, and an outhouse. This stark setting would have fit right in with John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath and was home sweet home back then. Clayton didn't really see any reason to walk the 50 yards up to where the house had burned down, but he had already come this far, so he decided to go ahead. He climbed over the locked gate, walked up to where the house once stood, and kicked around through the ancient burned-out rubble. Clayton had no idea what he expected to find. He didn't figure the new owners would care that he was up here poking around, even if they happened by, and besides, they probably lived in Oklahoma City or Dallas anyhow. It wasn't like there was anything left to steal. He walked into what he guessed would have been the living room, although he didn't trust his memory enough that he would bet money on it. There, lying half buried in the dirt, was the charred remains of an old cap pistol that had been in the house when it had burned. There was probably a pretty good chance that old charred toy pistol had once been a prized possession of one of his little brothers. Then he saw the old burned-out wooden kitchen stove where his mom had cooked many a meal. Since he remembered where it had set against the north wall of the kitchen, he was now able to orient himself, and all of a sudden he was back in the old home place instead of standing in the middle of a cow pasture out on the Miller Road. Clayton just stood there as 44 years rolled away, and he was once again a 16-year-old kid with his whole life ahead of him. He was in this halfway hypnotic trance as he walked out of what was once the back of the house toward what was once the barn. He passed by where the well used to be, saw the old tree with the limb where they had hung a hog they were butchering, and where he had also hung a chain horse he had borrowed from a neighbor to change out the motor in his 1946 Ford pickup. Clayton judged the distance to where he thought the barn would have been, and sure enough, he saw a few worn-out cultivator plows and some pieces of harness chain to verify that this was indeed where the old barn had been. As he glanced around, he realized this was about all there was left of the old home place, and time was in the process of even taking that. Clayton figured he might as well get back to the car and drive on over to Antlers and drop in on his sister he hadn't seen in years. As he started walking back toward the car, he noticed that he had automatically drifted over to the right as he walked past the old home site. He then remembered that this was where there used to be an old fence that separated the house from the pasture. Mrs. Tarkington had always rented these few acres of pasture to Jackie Greenwood to run his cattle on. Clayton remembered that there had been an old dirt road alongside the fence back then, although all signs of the road were long gone. It must have been instinct that had him walking where the road would have once been. He walked to a point which would have been the corner of the yard when he saw it. There it was, somehow still alive and bravely fighting the battle of time. How could this be? The odds had to be astronomical, but against all those odds, out in the middle of what now was an empty pasture, stood the rosebush his mom had planted years ago. Clayton walked over to the rosebush, sat down on the ground, closed his eyes, and let his life pass in review. The rosebush looked pretty much as Clayton remembered it from over 40 years ago, after his mom had stuck a single cutting in this almost barren Oklahoma ground and carried water from the well as it fought for its meager existence that first few years. It never was much of a rosebush, or at least nothing like the pictures of the ones shown in the seed catalogs they would get in the mail every year. As best Clayton could remember, it only produced a bumper crop of the beautiful roses that one year. Other than that once, it was pretty much like the woman who planted it and the sharecropper kids that chased the cattle away so they wouldn't trample it. The sharecropper family and the sharecropper rosebush always looked like they were one more bad year away from disaster. Never more than a few roses grew on the bush, but they always managed to bloom right when they were needed the most. Although Clayton tried to build a little fence around the bush to keep the cattle and other varmints away from the roses, it was pretty much a losing battle. As he stared at the bush, Clayton thought to himself, this old rose bush is a living monument to a time long past and has served its purpose on this earth quite honorably. Noticing the scraggly condition it was now in, he figured that the lonely rosebush at best had one or two more blistering Oklahoma summers left on this earth. Like a lot of things raised on this farm, it had lived its life right there on the edge, but at least it had always found the strength to keep going when it needed to, and when someone was depending on it. Clayton remembered as clear as could be the first time the rosebush had come through for him personally. It was his graduation from Moyers High School, and Mom's rosebush came up with that one perfect flower for his date for the prom. The next time he remembered, when the rosebush was called into duty, it offered up just enough roses for a bridal bouquet for his oldest sister's wedding. Those 2 times the sharecropper's rosebush acted just like a trusted member of the family, producing enough roses for the job at hand and saving Clayton and his sister from social embarrassment. The 3rd time they would turn to the rosebush for flowers for the family was, as far as he could tell, probably the reason God put that rosebush on this earth. Knowing the rosebush would never make it on its own, God must have gave his mom the desire and strength to draw water from the well every day and keep it alive for its important job that lay ahead. Clayton's mind drifted back to that last winter he spent there on the old Tarkington place. He almost shivered as he remembered just how uncommonly cold that winter was. Him and his brother Check's lean-to bedroom had cracks in the walls that were big enough to throw a cat through, as the old-timers used to say. His dad had picked up some empty cardboard boxes at Barden Taylor's grocery store when they were in Antlers, ripped them apart and tacked them up like wallpaper on their bedroom walls, and that kept a lot of the cold wind out. Luckily, their bedroom was on the south side of the house, or they might have froze to death. No one had time to think about Mom's rosebush during that freezing winter, and even if they had, there was nothing that could have been done. The sharecropper's rosebush appeared to be just another lost cause in a family that had grown used to lost causes. Spring came through like gangbusters that year, and lo and behold, one day, Clayton's mom quietly announced that the rosebush they had given up for dead was loaded down with rosebuds. You would have thought she would have been more excited about the rosebush looking like it was apparently going to have a bumper crop of flowers that year, but she never showed much emotion. Looking back from the safety of all the years that had now passed, Clayton realized that his mom must have sensed a dark omen of things to come when she saw the rosebush with all those young buds. That was just not the way a rosebush planted in Pushmataha County dirt was supposed to act. Clayton remembered how his mom would never get too upset when one of the little kids would break a toy or some other knick-knack. She would just sigh and say, "Seems like we can't have nothing." It now occurred to Clayton that life by this time had probably beaten his mom down so many times that even on a beautiful day, she could not let herself believe that a sharecropper's wife living on the Miller Road could even have a single rosebush full of beautiful flowers. It was a bitter truth to face, but it brought him much closer to her at this moment, sitting here by a rosebush she had planted over 40 years ago, than they had ever been in life. Looking back, he could see that destiny had already chosen his family's destination that spring, when the rosebush was loaded with buds and preparing for its summer filled with flowers. They were just along for the ride, never suspecting that it was the end of the line for life as they had known it up until then. Clayton's last memory as he got up from the ground by the rosebush was that his mom never got to see all those beautiful roses, the one and only year that the rosebush produced its bumper crop. That was the summer that, even though she was not that old, she must have come to the conclusion that she just couldn't take any more of a life where you just can't have nothing. On the morning the sharecropper's rosebush came alive with the roses that would cover her grave, she refused to open her eyes, and her battles were over.